Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Disney in Depth. It's been a bit of a hiatus, but along with my co-host Matt McKim. Matty, how you doing today?
I'm doing fine. How are you, little brother?
I am good. I'm good. It's been a fun week. Thanksgiving. Did you have a good Thanksgiving?
Yeah, very peaceful, very quiet. Yeah.
Okay.
How was yours?
Yeah. Quiet. Very quiet.
Not
Yeah.
quiet people, huh?
Yeah. Very. We're quiet people, I guess you could say.
You have a big family. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Um, our guest today, we tried a while back, and my internet was bad. I have to apologize to her. It was,
Yes.
yeah, it was a busy Sunday, a lot of football, a lot of this, a lot of that. So again, my apologies to Karen. Um, but I'm
Okay.
excited because the book. If you guys haven't gotten around to finding it, it's called Background Artist. There you go. The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong. Um,
Karen Fang.
incredible story. I can't wait to talk to her more about it.
Yeah.
Um, let's
Amazing
go ahead and
story, amazing man.
yeah. Let's actually go ahead and bring her on. Karen, good
Hello,
afternoon.
Karen,
How are you today?
I'm great. Good to see you both again.
It's good to
good
see
to
you
see you too,
too.
Karen. Glad we're gonna make
Karen,
this happen.
yeah, excited again. Our apologies for last time. Completely my internet, my fault. So
Oh,
I
I
wanted
get
to
it. I mean,
again,
this day and age, right?
yeah.
Technology.
Yeah. You're a professor at the University of Houston, and you got your degrees at Penn and also Johns Hopkins. You know,
That's
what
impressive.
drove you to this medium? What drove you to this area of expertise?
To film studies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question because my PhD is in British literature, and my
Yeah.
dissertation was in 19th century in romantic British Romanticism.
Hmm.
But I had started writing on film when I was in grad school, so I was publishing on film at the same time I was doing my dissertation. And I think anybody. I mean, we're in a visual medium today. I mean,
Yeah.
visual century people make images more than they write today. And so I think our generation, I think we're all around the same age. Like we were the start of it, right?
Yeah.
And I like a lot of kids, like I grew up on Spielberg and I had these sort of Spielberg fantasies, but I don't have the talent of Spielberg. And I certainly, I really, I didn't feel I had the means to sort of, you know, to take that kind of gamble that you had to do back then,
Yeah.
to get started. But I mean, I think I'm also deep down inside really just a researcher and a teacher too. And so in the end, sort of becoming a film scholar was really, I think, my destiny. And I would also say that, the training that I have as a literature scholar continues to inform me working on these more contemporary media, because if you're writing about film, you're always thinking about form. So being
Yeah.
trained as someone who studies poetry, the start of the 19th century was the rise of capitalism in the British
Yeah.
Empire. I write
Yeah.
about moments of cultural encounter. So I think the critical training that I had as in graduate school like only makes me a stronger, more effective researcher and writer about film and other visual
Yeah.
media today.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How did when you started the whole thing, when you started researching, Tyrus Wong, your background is so extensive. There's so many different subjects and so many different variables you could have picked. Why Tyrus? Why
Yeah.
why Tyrus Wong?
Yeah, well, I wasn't the first person to discover Tyrus, right?
Yeah. No.
Because Tyrus had been around for so long and had done so many
Yeah.
things. But like in many people, I really grew interested in him right around the time he passed in 2016.
Huh?
The documentary about him had just come out the year before, and then when he passed, died at 106. So there
Yeah.
was so much coverage of him at that time because it was such an amazing story. He passed at the end of 2016, which, if you remember, was right after the 2016 election. So there
Yeah.
was, I think, people were really drawn to this story at this time of this really terrible anti-immigrant sort of rhetoric.
Yeah.
Everybody was really drawn to the story of this immigrant who could not would might not have come to the US, and had he not been able to come to the US, we went our all of our childhoods universally would have been
Yeah.
different had Bambi
Yeah.
had never been made. And so that's the sort of kernel of the documentary. That was the story that was told when he passed. But then when you start learning about him and you realize, oh my gosh, he did all these other things. He was this fine artist before he worked in movie studios. After Disney, it was Warner Brothers, and then to me, what was always most interesting was the Christmas cards.
Yeah. Yes.
That in the middle of the 20th century, he was one of the nation's leading greeting card artists, making this distinctly, you can see one background here. This looks like a Bambi background, but it was actually a Christmas card design. The idea that Americans were going out in droves to buy this Chinese style Christmas card, was sort of this wonderful example of Asian American and American multiculturalism.
Yes.
So I think as a scholar, I was really fascinated by this artist who worked in so many different media, so many different industries. Like, what was the unifying thread in all of his creative work? And then, as an Asian American, this was incredibly inspiring to see the story of someone who had come in under such difficult circumstances, persevered, made this huge impact on American visual culture. And then you see this in the documentary, just what an amazing personality he was as well.
Yes. And very humble too. Very quiet and humble.
Yes.
It would be interesting actually for you to kind of set this all up, to kind of explain his father coming over here first and then going back for him, and that whole story of him coming to the United States and to the Golden Mountain, and it was it's fascinating, and the way you wrote this book, and it's so detailed, which is amazing. I love that. But his father had already been here, went back and wanted to give what he thought as this dream of a better place for his son, for his family, and yet it didn't start out that way.
No.
And it might be kind of interesting if you could kind of explain that, his father and bringing him over and what he experienced first.
Yeah.
And how he overcame that.
I think probably most Americans have immigration in their family at some point. Sure. Right. Yeah. Maybe it was more recent. My parents immigrated right before I was born. There were some people who immigrated, it's generations ago. But for Chinese Americans, it was for almost a century, it was particularly complicated because of the U.S. policy of Chinese exclusion, which was a federal policy for 60 years, from 1882 to 1943, which explicitly prohibited particularly Chinese Americans, but ultimately, or ethnic Chinese, but ultimately East Asians of any ethnicity.
Yeah.
And this had to do with after the railroads, after the gold rush, Chinese labor had been really valuable in making the railroads possible. But then once the railroads were completed, the U.S. didn't want Chinese laborers in the U.S. anymore for various reasons, and so they just created this federal policy to exclude them, to keep them out. And so it was very difficult to enter the U.S., very difficult to, if you entered the U.S., you could not become a naturalized citizen. You had very restricted rights. You usually had to reside in specific parts of town. You were not allowed to own land or to rent properties in your own name. You were restricted to very limited manual forms of manual labor. You weren't allowed to vote. You couldn't marry a white person. You couldn't, you couldn't engage. There were so many restrictions, and this whole policy of Chinese exclusion, even today, still is not widely taught in schools. Probably most people don't know about it. Myself, even because my parents came so much later after Chinese exclusion was ended, I didn't even know about it, even though in a way it was affecting me, right? So Tyrus's father, like so many ethnic Chinese, during this time at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, they wanted to enter the U.S. for opportunity, just like all of the people coming from Europe who wanted to enter the U.S. But because of exclusion, they had to answer much more stringent expectations of entry than if you were coming in through Ellis Island from Italy or from Ireland. there were very basic requirements, right? The Statue of Liberty is there to welcome the tired, the
Yeah.
hungry, the weak, right? Whereas, 2 years before the Statue of Liberty was raised, the Chinese exclusion had been established, saying that Chinese are not under almost very limited conditions allowed to enter. At one point,
Yeah.
the quotas were so strict that like I think 114 Chinese were allowed to enter 1 year. Like,
Wow.
so Tyrus's father was able to enter, like many Chinese at the time, by acquiring papers that presented him as a merchant. And that was like one of the few classes that were allowed to enter. You could be a merchant, you could be a student, or you could be a religious figure. And even if you had those papers, if you could prove them, you would be allowed to enter. But again, you would still have to answer to all of these requirements. You would be prohibited many rights, and you would still not be able to be naturalized a citizen.
Yeah.
You would be an alien excluded from citizenship was a legal term that was applied to ethnic Asians who were allowed to enter during this time. And so Tyrus's father, Luke Gett, entered in 1898, and he worked in California very quietly because, of course, if you're a Chinese, you just were trying to avoid the law, like trying to avoid harassment, trying to avoid assault, which frequently happened, theft. There had been terrible attacks on Chinese laborers before in earlier years. But Tyrus's father lived in the U.S. for 20 years.
Isn't that amazing?
Constantly planning a future for this family that at the time he really didn't even have. He had been married before he came to the U.S., but had spent most of his time in the U.S. But would go back to China. He very briefly at times, and so on one of his visits home, he and his wife conceived Tyrus, and then he went back to the U.S., continued working, saving all this money he could, so he could go back again, bring his son. And so he does this. This is a 20-year plan, essentially. And when he brings Tyrus back as a 10-year-old boy, Tyrus then has to go through this whole immigration protocol again. And so they've got these doctored papers giving him this identity as a merchant son with a new name. And when you entered in through Angel Island, which was the main immigrant processing center on the Pacific coast, whose primary job was really to investigate the East Asians who were coming across the Pacific. You would have to go through these very severe, very stringent interrogations. And so Tyrus, at the time, was a boy. He did not have pre-investigated papers like his father, who had already done this several times. And so he was separated from his dad, who was allowed to enter. And then Tyrus was detained in Angel Island for a month by himself, a 10-year-old child, doesn't speak the language. At the time, he's the only child in the detention center. And then when the interview finally takes place, he's given, I think he was asked 63 questions or 83.
Wow.
Can you imagine? I'm a mother. My oldest child was around that age when I started writing this book, and I knew there was no way my child could have done that in his own language, let alone,
Yes. Amazing. Talk about pressure, huh?
Yeah.
And your father wasn't with him.
He had been separated from his father for a month. He'd been alone, no relatives. He didn't speak the language. They had a translator, but again, these were facts he'd had to memorize because it was not his own identity. And so these were questions like, how many houses are on the street on which you live? Who lives on the third house down in the row? How many windows are in your house? Right?
Wow.
Which house does their teacher live in?
I was looking at some of the questions, and one of them was like, "Who lives 19 houses away from you?"
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know the people next door. Who lives 19? So for him to overcome all of these things and to get to see his father, I mean, I couldn't even imagine the joy that he must have felt,
the reunion.
and to be able to finally, the reunion with his father. So once he's with his father, where do they go from there? Where does he take him? Where do they end up after leaving Angel Island?
Well, Angel Island is in the bay off of San Francisco. So this is why the Chinatown San Francisco is the biggest Chinatown in the U.S. and largest and biggest. And so they go first into San Francisco, but only for a couple nights because his father had spent most of his time in Sacramento, which is more inland. And so very quickly they go to Sacramento, where Lipgat had his work all of these years. And Tyrus, the advantage of immigration when you're a child, right, is that you adapt quicker, right? So Tyrus goes to a mixed school in Sacramento. He makes friends, both white and Chinese. He learns English, and his father, like at this point, like he just feels like there's not a lot of opportunity for himself. The father, what's amazing is they came first class because they came over on steamships first class because that was one way of looking like a wealthy merchant son. But in fact, he was a laborer. So you can think about all the money he had to save to buy that first class ticket. And remember, he's doing manual labor at these like really depressed wages that were available for Chinese, right? So they this terrible sacrifice on the part of the father. And so after a couple of years in Sacramento, Tyrus's father decides that he maybe should relocate to Los Angeles, which at this time in the early 20s is just starting to really explode as a city. And so the father decides to go to LA first on his own to look for work, and he sort of leaves Tyrus on his own. And again, you sort of think like as a parent, like you're leaving behind this 14-year-old kid, go to school, You can imagine how that works out, right?
Yeah. He's got the issues. He said it himself. He was a self-proclaimed bad boy. He wanted to do his own thing. He didn't want to be in school. I know he, through your book and through the documentary, he had talent right away, but what really pushed him towards his talent? What made him start to seek it more? What was he doing that brought it on and out of him?
Yeah, well, he was really lucky that, Tyrus clearly the fact that he survived that 1 month ordeal in Angel Island, that he got through the interrogation interview, it sort of tells you that there was there's something, this resilience, this, self-reliance, this gumption, on this kid, right? And I think that was a thing that sort of made him memorable, also among friends and teachers. And so he wasn't, doing great traditionally at school, but at the same time, teachers sort of remembered him, and they all noticed that he was very interested in drawing and in art. And so when he's in Los Angeles in middle school, some of the teachers sort of noticed, like, maybe you should, maybe you can get a work doing lettering. That was a very common job. Remember, this is a really exploding city. There's all this industry. People need signs, right? And so he starts hearing this from the teachers, and one of the school principals suggests that he apply to art school. And there was in Los Angeles a number of art schools that were opening because, again, all of this suddenly exploding city, Hollywood's just getting started, right? All of this industry needs advertising and manuals, training manuals like drawn, and there's all this media that's rising. And so all of these art schools are developing, not just to teach fine arts, but also to teach commercial design and art. And so Tyrus gets a scholarship to the Otis Art Institute, and by landing there, he suddenly has the possibility of a very different path than most Chinese at this time. Most Chinese at this time, again, they're working in restaurants, they're doing manual labor, they're working in groceries or things like, in agriculture. Right. Yeah. And then to imagine being trained in art is essentially, first of all, it's not manual labor. I mean, you're using your hands, but it's delicate, it's creative, it's refined, right? It's the opposite of the ways in which like the Chinese have been presented to American society. It's just brute labor.
Yeah. The matchstick says it all for me. That to me is incredible. I was curious, is that still around? Is that in a museum somewhere?
No, unfortunately, I don't think the Matchstick Orchestra survives, but we do have that wonderful photo, which is in the book. So what Vince is referring to is a seventh grade art project that Tyrus did. So this is actually when he's still in Sacramento, before he's moved to LA, before he's won a scholarship to art school. But he makes a diorama of an orchestra using matchsticks and cardboard paper and paper clips. And it's just amazing. You can see all of the different instruments and and there's, just with these really modest materials. And it's not even sort of painting or art. For most of his career, he's working in two dimensions on paper. But you can see just like this kid sort of, seeing something and wanting to recreate it with his hands and with his imagination. And when you see a child do something like that, that child has something special.
Sure.
Yeah.
And his dad would encourage him to a certain degree, as far as the lettering and such, and getting scraps of paper and such, to the best of his means.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So this is his dad taught him Chinese calligraphy. So his father was a literate man and used to quote Chinese poetry and proverbs. And you think this is really interesting too, because again, the stereotype at that time, that the dominant stereotype of Chinese in the sort of white establishment like perception, right, was a very prejudicial racist stereotype of these sort of heathen Chinese, right, with the pigtails and their pajamas, eating strange food or something like that, because that's sort of, they didn't know the Chinese because the Chinese were all forced to live on the outskirts of town, right, and culturally they were very different, right, but because ironically, because the prohibition on Chinese immigration was so strict, the vast majority of Chinese who entered the U.S. were literate. Unlike, the portion of people who were arriving, in Ellis Island, many of whom were equally poor, they were not literate, right? And so someone like Tyrus's father was poor. That's why he was leaving China in the first place. But he was still an educated man who could read. He knew, in Chinese, of course, he was familiar with Chinese history and literature and proverbs. And so he used to quote these to Tyrus. And then he would teach Tyrus Chinese calligraphy, that, because remember, for their 15 years together in the States, it was just the two of them, Tyrus and dad, like that was their family unit, right? Because the mother and his sister were in China, they were separated all of these years. And so when Look Get would come home from this really long day, fixing shoes, working in a gambling den, working in the grocery, like this really like, humble, kind of invisible work, modest work, he would come home and teach Tyrus calligraphy, right? And to remind Tyrus, like, don't accept the versions of Chinese that Western society is trying to paint for us. Remember, you belong, you're inheriting a 1,000-year tradition, right? And so look at the beauty of these characters. So every night before he went to bed, Tyrus would have to fill a page, would have to practice his brushwork, fill at least one page of Chinese characters. And so even before Tyrus had any formal art training, he was already very proficient in using a brush.
So it's interesting that his father is making sure that he's learning his heritage, his Chinese heritage. Yet he's going out and he's playing baseball, and he loves baseball. And, he gets involved with the Boy Scouts, unofficially so, and everything. So he's becoming an American boy, but yet with his ties to China. So it's interesting that the Christmas cards have that same blend, what I mean? And this all started as a young boy. And
I don't know to what extent how many other people who are familiar with this experience, but as somebody who's bicultural myself, I'm Asian American, right? Like, I think depending on which generation you come from, when you're Asian American, like what era you were growing up, like people have very different feelings about sort of being ethnically different, having going home to a different culture, right? But what's amazing for Tyrus is that, it was so early in the 20th century, and he was very uncompromising, but like in a very like non-confrontational way. For him, he was always just he just intuitively felt, I'm both American and Chinese, right? And
Yeah.
he wasn't apologetic about either one, and he didn't see any kind of conflict between them.
Right.
For him, that they absolutely coexist, and I think that's, such a sort of like proudly unapologetic version of being Asian American, the two things
Uh-huh.
together, right?
Yeah.
And then selling that vision to everybody else through the Christmas cards.
Yeah.
Sure. Well,
You know, I
Yeah.
think the biggest thing in Tyrus's life and reading and research, I think the biggest thing that really had the impact on his life the most was Ruth. I think
Mm.
Ruth was just everything to him. I think she pushed him. I think she motivated him, and so is that it, is that what you think? Is that who, kind of drove his life in the direction that it went? Was it Ruth?
Well, I mean, Ruth and his parents, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's, because obviously, and hardly, I talk about this, how we hardly know anything about Tyrus's mother,
His mom.
and like once he left China, he never saw his mother again, and so
Yeah.
she sort of falls out of the story. But I think that's sort of wrong too, because we also have to starting with her sacrifice, right? To
Yeah.
sort of say that, like, I'm going to let you go, my
Yeah.
only son. I'll never know what will become of you, because I know this will be better for you. That's an incredible act of a mother,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
Completely
then
unselfish.
for what everything his father did, right? Like all
Yeah.
this anonymous work, all of this humble work, right? In order to
Yeah.
get his son like farther ahead than he could ever imagine achieve on his own, right? And
Yeah.
then and then Ruth does enter into Tyrus's life right when his father passes away,
Yeah.
and then Ruth also has this amazing story, which is very different from Tyrus's experience, because Ruth's parents had both come to the U.S. before exclusion started. They were
Yeah.
very fluent. They were fluent in English. They were very comfortable moving back and forth between white and Chinese culture. Ruth had been born in Bakersfield on this large farm that the family operated, so she was more privileged. Um, and Ruth had gone to UCLA and studied English, like English literature, and so but at the same time, you could tell, Ruth came from this big family, and so Ruth had everything that Tyrus didn't have. Ruth brought to him, right? Like, and so they perfectly complement each other, because Ruth also, you can tell, was sort of fascinated by this like life of a creative. Like when she meets Tyrus is graduating from art school. He's already starting to make a reputation as a fine artist. He's got this really like eclectic group of creative friends in like
Yeah.
young Los Angeles, Hollywood, Los Angeles, and stuff. And so they complemented each other, personality wise, absolutely professionally. Not only is Ruth, making a home, raising the kids, which in it of itself is like a partnership, right?
Yeah.
But then at the same time, like Ruth was, advising, when they're doing the Christmas cards, Ruth is like looking for Bibles excerpts, like reading,
Yeah.
finding poetry samples, like making lists of ideas of, picture ideas for him to like, so that he doesn't have to spend time thinking about that. He can just do the painting, right?
Yeah.
She writes his business correspondence, she balances
Yeah.
the books. So.
Yeah. And that's the other thing is, I wonder how the conversation went as far as when he wanted to go to Disney. Because he went to Disney in 1938,
38. Yeah.
and that's where everything kind of exploded, at least for him, as far as that.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that as far as what pushed him in that direction to Disney?
Well, it was Ruth. So they were newly married. They were expecting their first child. Tyrus's thing. It's they're just coming out of the Depression in '38, right? So you
Yeah.
can imagine you're not white. He's not even a citizen. He's a young man. He's trying to provide for his family. This new expanding family that he's about to have, right? And then Ruth says to him, "Why don't you apply to Disney? I heard they're hiring." Because remember, in 1938, it's right after Snow White.
White.
Disney is the biggest game in town, like
Yeah.
not just in animation, but in Hollywood, because
Yeah.
Disney has completely changed the game by showing
Yeah.
that future animation is a possibility, right? That audiences of all kinds will flock to theaters to watch feature animation, and Walt is eager to just continue like building on this reputation, and so he has this and Tyrus doesn't know it at the time that Bambi is the project,
Yeah.
All Tyrus knows is that Disney is hiring a lot of artists, and many
Yeah.
of his classmates from Otis had already gone there. He's able to like get his foot in the door because one of his friends from Otis sort of makes the introduction to get him into the trial period at the studios and stuff. So yeah, Ruth, starting from their marriage, Ruth is the one who says like, why don't you try Disney?
Yeah.
He was the one pushing.
Yes.
So he starts as an in-betweener.
Yeah.
And then there's an interesting story about how Bambi was going at the time. Do you want to elaborate upon that?
So Bambi, well, this Bambi was Walt's pet project. He'd just done Snow White. He wants to continue pushing the envelope. He'd already heard about Bambi. Bambi was a worldwide bestseller. And so he acquires the rights, the screen adaptation rights for the English translation from Sidney Franklin, who at that time had just overseen The Good Earth, interestingly, a film about China. And so they, Sidney Franklin had this idea that he originally wanted to do, and then he realized it's all about animals. He's like, oh, this is not going to work as live action. So he says to Walt, like, why don't you try this? And Walt loves the idea. And so Walt immediately thinks, I'm going to approach this like Snow White. There's no problem that money can't solve. I just need to get more artists, right? And that's how he did Snow White, right? Because of all the upheaval in Europe, there were all these artists in Europe. I'm getting some feedback. Are you hearing?
Yeah. There's an echo.
Just a little bit, just a little interruption.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're good now.
Okay.
Oh,
I
no.
can still hear it, but I'll just try it.
I can still hear it too. Yeah, there's an echo.
I'm not getting an echo.
No.
I can hear it on my end.
Yeah, I can hear it as well. Let me see. I'm gonna mute mine and see if it's me.
Okay.
Are you still getting it?
I'm still getting it.
Yeah. Okay. I can mute.
Are you still getting it, Karen?
Not right now.
No, me either.
Okay, maybe it's not. Okay, so
I'll mute mine until I want to come on.
Okay.
Okay.
So we were talking about Walt's plan for Bambi was to do what he had done with Snow White, which is just to keep growing the studio, to bring in more artists. So he's just hiring artists right and left. There's even more artists who want to come to Disney because of this incredible success of Snow White. So he's got the live model drawing sessions that he'd been doing in Snow White suddenly become like live animal drawings, right? He's got a naturalist on retainer, like spending time in the woods, like drawing animals. They've got a menagerie on the studio set, like they have animal dissection classes, like they're rotoscoping animals. They're doing everything that they possibly can, because if you think about the technical challenges of Bambi are, as not surprisingly, all of the challenges of Snow White, which is storytelling, emotion, movement, the realism of movement, but it's harder because now it's all animals.
Yeah.
Right? And every animal moves differently.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you make an animal convincingly talk? Because their faces are all different.
Yeah.
Right. So the technical challenges are extraordinarily hard. And so, Tyrus is stuck in, back in the Hyperion studios, like with all the other in-betweeners, just sitting there staring at light boxes, like redrawing shorts, like every little bit of movement to get that illusion of life. And he just sort of hears, because remember, he's got all these friends from all his sort of Otis alumni friends from art school who are higher positioned than him in the studio. So he's probably hearing from them, like, the talk about the larger project that is not working.
Yeah.
And Tyrus, again, this is the sort of get up and go gumption, of an immigrant American. Like if you don't, you don't look for your opportunities, then opportunities will pass you by, right?
Yeah. So
Tyrus thinks like, well, maybe I can figure something out. So he goes to the Los Angeles Public Library. And again, I just love, there's so many things about LA and about immigrants that are happening. So the LA Public Library, the Central Branch on Bunker Hill, at that time was one of the busiest public libraries in the United States.
Yeah.
And it had just been built.
Yeah.
But it was because there were so many immigrants and transplants and new people in the city of Los Angeles who were just trying to make their lives better.
Yeah.
And so, you know, remember, immigrants, public libraries in the US were founded by Andrew Carnegie and immigrants, right?
Yeah.
You know? And so,
Yeah.
you know, and so like this sort of thing, like all of these sort of institutions that foster self-help, people who want to help themselves are just, you know, I think a fundamental like theme in the story. And so Tyrus is already familiar with that library because when he was going to Otis Art School, he'd have to walk home to Chinatown at night. And he often would stop in the public library to go check out books on Chinese art. Because you know he's every day he's studying Western Europe, he's studying European art history and media, but he'd already had all this training as Chinese calligraphy. And again, I love this. Like he's a teenager and he's sort of thinking like, well, you know, sure, this is great since the Renaissance, quattrocentric perspective painting, that was pretty important. But you know, Chinese painting's been around for 1,000 years. Like I think it's pretty good too. I'm gonna go learn about that. And so you know, Tyrus had already been going to the Los Angeles Public Library, checking out books, you know, about Chinese painting. So when he starts hearing these problems with Bambi, he says, well, let me go to the library and let me go get that book myself.
Yeah.
And so he goes and gets the English translation of Bambi. He reads the same version that Sidney Franklin, that Walt Disney had read. And he says like, oh, well, it's all outdoors. Like, you know, I can make a forest.
Yeah.
You know, and so he makes some sample paintings. And he shows it to the people who are, you know, the people he knows and in betweening, and they sort of say, they can see it right away that this is something, and they take it to Walt, and Walt famously says, "I like this. It's a whole lot better than all that indecipherable junk behind them." Because what Walt understands once he sees it, once he sees Tyrus's paintings, is that the previous backgrounds have been too detailed. Too precise, which was great for Snow White, but not when you have these animals, you know, that are in that kind of forest. You know, and you need to see those animals because they're the story.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the other thing too, is, you know, he's drawing all these and so all of a sudden the characters are coming to life more and more, and they bring him up to doing other things. Are you hearing me okay, Karen?
Yeah.
Is it acting up again?
It just I hear an echo.
Bit of an echo, but it was only bothering me when I was talking and I could hear my
okay. I'm going to mute again.
Okay.
But you know, so then he gets moved up, and the whole movie is turned around, and it's basically Tyrus's work after that. It's all about Tyrus. How, you know, what were his thoughts on that? What was he thinking when he saw that it was going to be completely his work?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to what Matt was saying about how modest Tyrus was as a person, right?
Yeah.
And I think, and I also think this is really, it's a wonderful sort of version of art, right?
Yeah.
Because I think, again, we all have these ideas from like Van Gogh or, you know, that like art has to be like this tortured personality, right? And we don't think about art like can just be sort of uplifting and inspiring. It doesn't have to get, you know, and it doesn't have to be like world changing, or it doesn't aspire to that, right? And in fact, Tyrus's art was world changing in a way, right? It made Bambi possible, but he wasn't going into that with that ambition. And then the other thing, you know, the other thing to sort of keep in mind is that because animation was evolving so quickly at that moment, right? There wasn't even a category or a role, a label to describe what he was doing. So now in retrospect, we can look at what Tyrus was doing and we can say, oh, he was the lead concept designer. He was the inspiration artist, to use John Canemaker's term, right? But, you know, back then, like they just done Snow White. Now they're working on Bambi. Like, you know, he was hired in Disney's story department, right? So like they're crafting with like adapting the story. And then he's eventually labeled as background artist, you know, as if he was the person who was painting the backgrounds that were being, you know, underneath the animation cells, which is not what he was doing either. What he was doing was creating concept sketches, right? But, you know, they just simply didn't have a label or a category for that at that time, right? But he was setting the vibe of the film. And so, you know, I think it's, you know, Tyrus was glad to have the work. He was glad not to be an in-betweener anymore. He loved infinite creativity, because that's what you do when you're a concept artist, is you just
Yeah.
do whatever you want, they
Yeah.
just want you to keep on giving them ideas. And that's
Yeah.
incredibly fun for someone like Tyrus, who has this, like sort of fervent imagination, right?
Yeah.
And I think he was happy for that,
Yeah.
Tyrus, remember, this is somebody who can't even be a citizen at
Yeah.
that time. And not only
Yeah.
is he going every day to work in an art studio, an animation studio, and not in a restaurant or, cleaning somebody's house, right?
Field. Yeah.
He was actually one of the highest paid people on his little street in East Hollywood that he lived in with Ruth.
Yeah.
That was again, it goes back to, like, he achieved more than what his parents probably ever even hoped for.
Yeah, I'm sure. And so, things are going great, everything just running along smooth, and then the 41 strike comes along. So he got some pretty bad advice, but so what happened there?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't even say that he got bad advice. I mean, the strike was, it depends on who wants to tell the story, right?
Yeah.
He, like so many artists, was let go after
Yeah.
the strike, even though he
Yeah.
had stayed inside, he had not walked the
Yeah.
picket line,
Yeah.
but after after 41, it's a different world, right? The US is at war at this,
Yeah.
at this point, right? Like, Hollywood is suffering because the movie exports to Europe are, cut. This huge part of the European market is cut off now,
Yeah.
right? So all of the studios are having to rethink their budgets and their output. And so, after hiring all of those artists, from 35 through 38, suddenly, like, is doing a lot of belt tightening like everybody else in Hollywood. And then
Yeah.
the strike offers him an opportunity, not just to clean house politically or ideologically, to whatever extent you want to interpret that, right?
Yeah.
But also just simply to sort of, to cut the fat
Yeah.
in the studio, that's the way. I'm not saying that any of those artists were fat, but
Yeah.
the
No, I
studios
get that.
had to be leaner in
Yeah.
order to survive,
Yeah.
to live through the war, right?
Yeah.
And Tyrus at that point was his 3-year standard studio 3-year contract was up, right? So everybody was hired from Disney. It started with a standard 3-year contract, which was then to be determined for renewal at that end of this 3-year period. And so, it would have been hard, especially because the only project Tyrus worked on had been Bambi,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
His career though, I kind of go back and forth in my head. His career pretty much took off after that though. I mean, it just, from the Christmas cards to Warner Brothers, I mean, it just exploded after that, and he was just so prolific after that,
And how long was he at Warner Brothers?
for 28 years, almost
Wow.
3 decades.
That was a long time.
Yeah. So he lands on his feet because he's able to go, straight from Disney to Warner Brothers. And he's doing live action motion picture sketches. So he's not exactly doing the same kind of concept level, the same kind of vibe setting as he's doing at Disney on Bambi. But I mean, he's also in a major studio, which, again, to be in this time of the war, right? Where everybody's like, where there's wartime rationing going on and everything, to suddenly go to like this major studio where there's like a cafeteria, right? There's like cash, that you could pick up your salary at the cash office every week, right? I mean, there's a kind of stability that Warner Brothers provided that, wasn't the case at a young, hungry, agile, like high profile, but still sort of like precarious studio like Disney. Right.
Yeah.
And so at Warner Brothers, and the Warner Brothers also at that time was already a union shop. So, the whole animator strike had been a fight over unions. But when he goes to Warner Brothers, he has to join the union in order to be hired at Warner Brothers. And so when he's hired at Warner Brothers, because of union standards, his entry level salary at Warner Brothers is close to his highest pay at Disney.
Yeah. Yeah. Two things, Matt, your mic didn't reverberate last time you had it on, so I think it might be okay now.
Oh, okay.
And secondly, Karen, who, and I know from the book, but who was the one that brought him into the fold as far as Hallmark cards?
Yeah.
Well, so Hallmark cards came at the sort of in the middle of what was already this like really prolific and visible greeting card career. So he starts in greeting cards through a Disney connection because a lot of Disney artists were greeting card artists. They would sort of do this on the sideline. And again, this sort of goes back to sort of like the vitality of American visual culture in the mid-century, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, now everything happens on a screen, but back then it was like print media, you know. And so even if you're working in Hollywood, a lot of people who are working in Hollywood like came from art schools like Tyrus, and they would also have like a vibrant sort of side career or additional career in doing print art, graphic design and things like that. And so Tyrus's friend, Richard Kelsey, he was another Otis friend and a longtime Disney employee, was also very well known as a greeting card artist. He was an art director at California Artists, which was a very prominent greeting card company that at the time was based, I think, in Long Beach. And so Dick says, and Dick, funnily, was a gourmand and he loved Chinese food. So even after Tyrus had moved to Warner Brothers, he would see Dick all the time in Chinatown. So Dick one time like runs into Tyrus and says like, why don't you try Christmas cards? You know, and Tyrus, always modest, sort of says like, oh, I don't know, but you know, he's like, give it a shot. And you know, Dick says like, just give me a couple of samples and let me see what I can do with them. And the 3 of the samples that Tyrus does like for a fan immediately become like bestsellers. And then within a couple years, he's like California Artist of the Year. And so there would be like whole albums of his cards that you could go to the like Robinson's like department store, you know, and you could like look and see, oh, I want this design. I'm going to, you know, have my name printed on the envelope or whatever and stuff like that. And it was, he'd been a greeting card artist for about 15 years or so when Hallmark, the nation's leading greeting card company, signs a contract with him.
Wow.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
I still see parts of his cards here and there. I see the influence of cards today in other cards, and I wonder if they recycle that on another level. You know that.
Well, no, I mean, he was so popular as a greeting card artist nationally that it was actually an issue for of companies pirating his cards or hiring artists to imitate his style. And so, you know, one of the funny things, like we talked already about Ruth's importance, like as a business partner and a creative partner in the greeting card. It was actually a sort of family thing where the daughters, Tyrus has 3 daughters, and, you know, and you think about them like, you guys are based in Los Angeles. You both, you know, Matt, I know your father had this amazing career. Like, you know, how much do people really understand what their parents do when they grow up in and around the industry, right? Because sometimes it's kind of hard to understand.
Sure.
Even if you grow up there, but like if your dad's a greeting card artist, like everybody understands that because everyone's had a greeting card artist. They've held it, like they've all received it, right? And so his daughters they would always like go to the stores and always like go and check out to see where the album was. And if the album was behind somebody else's, they put the album in front to make sure that the customer saw the album first. And they would keep an eye out for these imitations because that was the only way to know if he was getting all the royalties that he deserved, and like, you know, making sure that the company that he was contracted to was protecting his copyright.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow. Very interesting.
You know, Matt's got a little funny story. He kind of knows where the Wong house is. Do you not, Matthew?
Yes. So Tyrus and his family, well, the daughter still is there, is only a half a mile away from the house that I grew up in, which is where I'm at right now, taking care of my mom. And the funny thing is, so he started in 1938. My dad didn't start until 1954 at Disney. So he had already been gone.
Yeah.
But my dad didn't really know him well. But I do remember him, you know, he would always point out the cards if they came into the house, you know, this is Tyrus's, but and very distinctive, of course. But their kids, you know, Tyrus was older than my dad, and so their kids older than us. And but they went to all the same schools we did,
Oh, really?
and we didn't know them. I did bump into Kim, the youngest one, here just a couple of months ago, and we had a great chat.
Yeah.
But his middle daughter,
Eileen.
Tylene, worked at Imagineering, so during the WED days.
Uh-huh.
And I remember my dad mentioning that one of the girls, and Kim wasn't exactly sure who it would have been, but one of the girls was up for a scholarship, a Disney scholarship. And my dad was one of the judges and had thought that she was worthy of the scholarship, and she didn't get it. And my
Oh,
dad was actually upset, saying she should have gotten it. She was worthy of it. But Kim didn't know who exactly it was. And I know Kim went to Otis,
mhm.
correct?
So
I
Kim
think she
went to
said Otis.
no, Tyling went to Otis. Kim went to
Oh,
Chouinard.
that was
Oh,
it. Okay. Yes. She went to Chenard's, which my dad did also.
Okay.
And that's right. Tyling went to Otis,
Yeah.
like her dad. That's
wow.
right. So she did work, and I forget how many years and what years exactly. I know it was early 70s, if I'm not mistaken, that she was at Disney's. And I
Yeah.
don't know how long.
I don't know. We haven't talked about it that much. Tyling, they're all wonderful. They're all amazing.
Yes.
And they're all very distinct. And Tyling, I think Tyling looks the most like Tyrus also.
Oh, really?
Um,
Okay. I've only
yeah.
met Kim. Yeah.
And then Tyling also, like, at some point, like, Tyling's traveled the most. And she, at some point,
Mm,
like, she worked in Hong Kong as like a magician's assistant. So,
really?
like,
Interesting.
Wow.
Interesting.
yeah, so
Wow.
you can just sort of see that, like, and that was something I try to show in the book too, like,
Yeah.
the sort of like what it was like to have as Ruth and Tyrus's parents, like,
Yes.
again, this sort of Asian American stereotype of these tiger parents who push you to be respectable and to become a doctor or a lawyer type things, and like, these girls just had a completely different upbringing.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Oh, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
he's had this just illustrious career. He's just an American legend as far as I'm concerned. And then he goes into something that's completely just amazing. He starts getting into flying and building his own kites. What
Yeah.
what prompted that? What prompted him to do something like that?
Well, once again, Ruth. So
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
he was retired, and
Hmm.
he sort of like, Tyrus was so busy, right? He had been doing all his Christmas cards at the same time he was working at Warner Brothers, and he was
Yeah.
taking art commissions. He was like, not someone, again, typical immigrant, like not someone to sit around.
Yeah.
And so, suddenly he's retired from Warner Brothers, and he's, in good health, and what's he going to do with his time? And Ruth sort of says, oh, go fly a kite. And he's like, and remember, kites are originally a Chinese invention,
Yes.
Yeah.
right? He remembered flying kites as a kid in China. He every now and then had done it for fun, and so he just sort of on his own, he decides to start making kites. And typical Tyrus, like, he sort of decides he's going to not just like design any, like, make a standard kite. He like researches different types of kites. He crafts them with his, the material, starting from the materials themselves. And and then they just become incredibly elaborate, making all these animals with moving parts, like these really long centipedes, right? Like flocks of kites that all fly together, like looking like birds, to the point at some point, like, that like the police at one time come over and tell them that, that they're afraid that the birds are going to like stop traffic, or like I mean, it's like, just wonderful. A wonderful sort of another a whole new artistic medium, and one
Yeah.
that's also like collective, right? Because then he
Yeah.
goes and flies them, and then becomes this regular thing where it starts with just its couple of friends and other kite enthusiasts, and very quickly becomes this regular thing where everybody sort of knows that on one Saturday a month they can go to Santa Monica Beach. It's one part of Santa Monica Beach. He'll be there, and then so other people come up all over California to join. And then, passerby who just happen to be on the beach and are fascinated by the kites, start coming more. And so, and so once again, he's transforming people's lives with
Yeah.
his
Sure.
creativity.
And that's the thing
Amazing.
is, the transformation and I think he wasn't really honored, like, in your book and in the documentary. People didn't really start recognizing till after he turned 90 years old. You know, and thank God he got to see so much and experience so much of that. But why was he not honored earlier? Why was it so much later that he was found to be this amazing artist? Why wasn't it earlier in his career?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was very well known as a greeting card artist, right? So for
Yes.
those people, like usually, you know, the mistresses of a household, right?
Yeah.
He was very well known to sort of like middle class woman who would be doing
Yeah.
the ones who would buy the Christmas cards. So that there was a time where he was. I think he did get like a lot of sort of professional gratification, you
Yeah.
know, that was public.
Yeah.
And then in very early on, before his sort of shift to commercial work, he had this reputation as a rising young fine artist. But you know, certainly the acclaim he starts to get by the time he's in his 90s, right, is wonderful because it's one that really recognizes the whole scope of everything that he's done, and also
Yeah.
recognizes that, you know, the background against which he did it. Right,
Yeah.
that it was against which he achieved that, right? Which is
Yeah.
not just that he could do work in all of these medium and like and make this a lasting contribution. So, you know, if the only thing he had done had been Bambi, and if he had been, you know, a white citizen, it would still be a significant contribution, right?
Yeah.
And then to think that
Absolutely.
the Bambi had just been one thing out of all of these other things that he'd done, and that he did it as a non-white, non-citizen,
Yeah.
right? You know, it just becomes this incredible story that
Yeah.
nobody can resist. And so, you know, in 2001, he's a Disney legend.
Yeah. That the pinnacle, and to know that his art is still looked at the studios everywhere. You know, you can see the influences all over the place with his art, and that's amazing to see. He was so prolific and so incredible that, again, he's an American legend as far as I'm concerned. He really
Yeah.
is.
No,
And a
I mean, sort of
specific
what you were saying
style.
a moment
Yeah.
ago about the way that his work is still looked at by animators today. Like, and also it's not just like within animation. Also, animation's more important than ever before
Yeah.
because of gaming and augmented reality and everything. Like, you know, animation used to be this kind of like, you know, category in moving pictures, and now it's
Yeah.
like I think the sort of dominant method in a way,
Yeah.
right? But you know, people look to him like not just because they, you know, they find him as story inspiring, but they look to him because it's a model about innovation and finding
Yeah.
solutions and creativity and pushing boundaries. And so my book launch day, my first book talk was to launch a book was in Oakland. And so we had a bunch of Pixar artists, like young Pixar
Oh,
artists, and
yeah.
they were all telling me like how they still look at his work or how they hear about him from other people, and you know how inspiring they find it. So
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. He had
It's
such a
just
style that was so specific, and I think, you know, for a film like Bambi, and of course Disney only released it every 7 years.
you know,
yeah.
So it would only be seen at certain times. But the greeting cards themselves was an ongoing thing that would be in someone's home that they could look at over
yeah,
and
Yeah.
over and over too. So two very different experiences, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, and probably most people who bought the Christmas cards had no idea that he made
Mm.
Bambi possible, and
Yeah.
yet probably
Well,
most people like they experience it at both ends of their life, you know, both moments.
Yeah.
and it's interesting too, because I mean, you talk about 28 years at Warner Brothers, and you know, what were his contributions at Warner Brothers? And that's really not spoken so much,
Yeah.
you know, and that's quite a career, 28
Yeah.
years, you
Yeah,
know.
and one of the things I mean, I love every part of the book, and I'm very proud of the book. But like the Warner Brothers chapter, like I just really to give a glimpse of what life was like in a big studio at the height
Yeah.
of the studio era, right?
Yeah.
And like the way, like for Tyrus, like to go into this community of creatives, to like have make a good living, to be able to put his family in a nice suburban home because of
Yeah.
like union protection and
Yeah.
salary and stuff like that. I just think I Warner Brothers it was amazing for him, and Warner Brothers benefited so much because of him. Because one of the
Sure.
things I also show in the book is like the ways in which like his art is like in the credits. Like
Yeah.
it's credit art, you know, it's a prop art, you know,
Yes.
how he even appears himself in the Helen Morgan story, like as an artist on screen, like, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
There are
absolutely.
so many. If you look at his credits, there are so much that he did, from concept art to miniature. I mean, he just worked on everything. He helped everybody, and It's right there. And again, guys, if you get a chance, you have to get this book. Background Artist: The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong.
Yes, and the audiobook is also really good. So
Oh,
it's narrated by Caroline McLaughlin, who's Chinese American herself and an award-winning audio narrator. And I just like, for those of you with long commutes, I recommend the audiobook. So,
there you go.
It,
But
it, it, yeah,
so much detail,
yeah,
Karen. It
yeah,
really delves into every little nook and cranny, which
yeah,
is wonderful. That doesn't
yeah,
always happen.
yeah. The detail, I gotta say, you put in a lot of research and it absolutely shows. It's an amazing book. It's one of my favorites.
Yes.
So
thank you.
everybody, I'm recommending this book as high as I can give. It really
Great
is.
present.
Yeah. Christmas presents
There you
available
go.
on
Christmas.
Amazon, wherever you can find books, guys. So take a look. Definitely, it's a great book. Karen,
And
we want to thank you so much for being patient with us. You
yes,
know,
Yeah, thank you
our
so much.
hiccups and glitches, but thank you so much for coming on. Oh my gosh,
Thank
it's been
you.
such
Thanks
a
for the
pleasure.
invitation.
Thank you.
great story, and it's a pleasure to get to know you too. And thank you
Yeah,
for sharing the story.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Hopefully we can talk to you again in the future. Maybe
Yes.
get some more
Thanks for
insight.
having me.
But all right, Karen, thank you
Thank
much.
you,
Have a
Karen.
great day.
Thanks,
Again,
Sarah.
guys, Background Artist: The Life and Work of Tyrus Wong. Go out, take a look, and we
Christmas
will.
gift.
Yeah, Christmas gifts, guys. All right, everybody, take care. Have a great Sunday, and we will see you guys real soon. Thanks
All right.
again,
Thank
Karen.
you.
Have a great day. Bye bye.